Hello and welcome back to this third part of Chapter 7 where we're talking about content creation and sharing. So another type of content that you could create is called a host webinar. So webinars are like a seminar, and typically people will sign up for a webinar. It's delivered and streamed at a certain time, and so people would need to connect. And so you might connect by calling into a phone number or accessing it however they do a link for you. Lots of webinars are going to be business to business type of marketing activities. And what you will typically find in them is some kind of a visual aspect of a slideshow presentation or a live stream video of some type. And they'll last between 1 or 2 hours. And so a company who's doing that is providing information, but in order to have people get access to it, they want to collect some information on the people that are using it. So this information they're collecting then could become new potential clients, and so they're generating a leads list of people they will contact to see if they can generate sales from that. So just like with webcasts or podcasts, there are ways you can set up a webinar that's either free or very low cost. You need to know how many people are going to probably attend, so that determines on computer size, and then you need to know if it's going to be uh, streamed out, and the content, how much of that content needs to really look good as it's streaming. You may have to pay more for a higher bandwidth in order to get that stream so that it looks good. And so you don't want to come across it looking very poorly done, or that when it's streaming it looks choppy or grainy. And so maybe you want to have something more professionally done. You may want to pay to have it hosted on a website that's going to make sure the content is streamed appropriately. So some things to think about: if you're going to do a webinar, you need to think it's going to be live for the most part. So if it's live, if the speaker does something that you don't like, or gets sidetracked, or something happens, well, that's going to be there and you can't go back and correct that. Also, if you say something, you might produce uh, audience feedback that's very negative, and then that's hard to recover from as well. So as you're doing the webinar, you need to think about what kind of questions your audience might have. If they don't have any questions, you might want to develop your own Q&A at the end of your webinar, just so that you're answering generic questions that you typically would hear, so that then the audience, wouldn't ask those later on. You also want to prepare to deliver your webinar so you know what you're doing at each of the different steps of, if you're doing slides, whatever they are, to turn those out. Make sure you start on time, and that you're not really trying to sell throughout the entire webinar. And so again, that webinar becomes part of your marketing mix. It's used with other types of media. Some benefits of doing a webinar is that you're typically going to get a very large audience, so usually 500 or more. They don't need to travel, so again, it's great for businesses who want their employees to do some learning or be informed about something. So they don't have to pay for the travel, they don't have to pay for the food either, that if they had travel, what they would be doing. The audience gets to ask questions immediately during the webinar. Sometimes it's saved to the end, but then they get immediate feedback, and so they're not having to type and wait for somebody to respond. And because you're collecting information before they get access to the webinar, one thing you might collect is their email address. And then so later on, after the webinar is over, you can send targeted messages to those users who attended the webinar. So you may be asking yourself at this point, which one would you do, a webinar or a podcast? So you may need to consider what medium you're going to use. Keep in mind, webinars are live streaming, and so you're going to need a lot of bandwidth in order to make sure that gets out there properly, and you're not going to have any problems with people seeing and hearing that. Podcasts, you're not going to have the problems with people stuttering or doing something that's not what you wanted in the output, so you can go back and edit that, and then they can download that at a later time. Webinars are also going to be useful for when you're trying to impart some information, where you're doing some kind of training and there's learning or collaboration taking place. So with a podcast, then, like I was trying to allude to here, is that you're not going to be as interactive. You're not going to be able to answer questions immediately, but you could still provide an email address at the end of your podcast where people could ask questions, and then you could actually answer those questions on your next podcast. And so then, depending on what you want to do, you can use both of these tools, webinar, podcasts, or just one, or combine them with the other things that you're going to be using, such as a blog or a video blog. Some best practices for the things that we've been talking about, and this probably is just common sense if you think about it, but you want to have some catchy titles for your blog, your podcast, or your webinar. You want to make sure you update that frequently so that people don't think that you've abandoned the content and not producing any more new content. You want to focus. You want to allow people to make comments, or if you're doing a blog, to write something back for them. You also are going to have to think about how you promote that blog, your streaming video, podcast, or webinar, because people aren't just going to find it out of thin air, and so you need to have some kind of plan on how you're going to promote that. I know for me, if I subscribe to some technical journal, then that technical journal has released my email to people who think that whatever they're producing I might be interested in, whether it's a blog, a podcast, or a webinar. You want to try and make it, if we go on to step 6 here, make things as engaging as possible and get that interaction. That's what people are wanting to get when they're going to these different types of content. You also want to avoid any negativity that just turns people off. So make sure that your content is good and that you can stand by that content. You want to cross-promote again across these different types of areas. You want to make sure that once the time has passed, you want to archive the content so that people can still go back and look at that. I've used that Bob and Sherry example, and so it works out rather well. You can go back and in time and listen to content that was produced a month ago. And then, just like everything else we've been discussing, you want to make sure that you're measuring what the purpose is for why you're doing this in the first place, so that you can make adjustments or know that this is what you should continue with, or maybe you should abandon it. And that ends this chapter on content creation and sharing.